We're moving in next week. The nursery's perfect." Halden said it so casually, like telling me they were bringing over a pie. His fork clinked softly against his plate, as if the gravity of his words hadn't just cracked the air wide open. Kaylee didn't even look up. She was smoothing the napkin across her lap with one hand and reaching for the water pitcher with the other. Her smile smug and soft around the edges. "It'll be so nice to be settled before the baby comes." And the light in that upstairs room, just beautiful. I sipped my water and set the glass down gently. My fingers curled slightly around the rim. "That's awkward," I said. "I sold the house last Friday. It wasn't loud. I didn't raise my voice or make a scene. I simply told the truth and watched it land like a glass dropped from the second floor." Halden blinked. What, I sold the house?" I repeated, my voice calm and steady. Signed the closing papers. Friday morning, the buyers were a lovely couple. Young, first-time homeowners. Kaylee's hand froze mid-reach for the breadbasket. Her eyes narrowed, blinking fast. "You didn't say anything. I didn't know I needed to." I pushed a napkin into my lap and looked between them. "You didn't ask." Halden laughed once sharp and hollow. "You knew we were planning to move in. We talked about the nursery. Kaylee even brought over paint samples. Without my agreement," I said more firmly this time. "You two brought in swatches. Talked about renovations. Never once did either of you ask me if that was something I was comfortable with." Halden leaned forward, his face reddening. "We're your family." "That's right," I replied. "And yet you treated this place like a future entitlement. Not a home I've maintained alone for 23 years. Kaylee's voice edged in cold sweetness. "You knew we were having trouble with the rental. You knew the lease was ending." "I did." I nodded. "And I also knew you never once asked if moving in here was an option. You decided it was." "Without me." A silence swept over the table. I could hear the faucet dripping faintly in the kitchen. The tick of the wall clock sounded louder than it should have. Halden scoffed, shaking his head. "You're seriously telling us you sold the house out from under your own son and pregnant daughter-in-law?" "You're my adult son with a college degree, a job, and a wife," I said, "not a dependent. And I didn't sell it out from under anyone. I sold my home. After careful thought, quietly. Because it was time." "But why now?" Kaylee's voice rose, her tone brittle. "You know how much we needed this." "I know how much you wanted it," I corrected gently. "That's not the same." Halden shoved his chair back, wood scraping on wood. "You're being unreasonable." "And you've been presumptuous," I said, evenly refusing to flinch. "I'm allowed to make decisions about my own life." He stared at me. Jaw set, lips pressed tight. Kaylee's expression was harder to read, but there was a tremor in her hands now. "I'm not doing this here," Halden muttered, grabbing his jacket from the chair behind him. "Neither am I," Kaylee added, standing stiffly. They didn't say goodbye. Just left the half-eaten dinner cooling on the table and walked out into the night. I listened to the front door close, then the car start and drive away. The silence that followed was sharper than the argument. I gathered the plates, slowly rinsing them under warm water. My hands were steady, but inside me, something twisted. Grief, anger, and relief braided into something I couldn't name. I set the last glass in the rack and wiped my hands on the dish towel. Then I walked down the hallway, flicked off the lights, and stood in the dark of what used to be called the nursery. It had never been anyone's but mine, and for now, it still was. The first time I saw Kaylee's parents looking around the house, it wasn't with admiration. It was with calculation. They were over for coffee on a Sunday, just a casual drop-in or so, I thought. Halden had texted that morning, said they were driving out this way, and asked if I minded if they stopped by. I'd said yes, because I always said yes, even when I didn't feel like putting on a clean sweater or setting out mugs for 5 instead of 1. Kaylee's mother, Clarice, wandered into the hallway like she was just stretching her legs. Her fingers trailed along the frame of the guest room door before she peeked inside. This would make a lovely reading nook, she said more to herself than anyone else. Her husband, Martin, stood near the fireplace and said nothing, but I saw him eyeing the mantel, then glancing toward the ceiling, counting vents. Measuring light, I didn't ask. I didn't have to. Halden and Kaylee were in the kitchen, laughing over something on her phone. I stood at the edge of the dining room holding my lukewarm coffee, watching the four of them move through my space like it had already changed hands. Later that evening, I opened the junk drawer in the hallway to grab a pen and found a stack of paint swatches. Pale green sky blue beige with a hint of pink, neatly clipped together with a paperclip. Not mine. I opened the closet across the hall, and there they were, 2 baby monitors still in the box, tucked next to a folded towel and a basket of expired coupons. Not mine either. I sat down at the edge of the bed. My body felt heavy, as if it finally understood what my mind had been resisting. This wasn't a suggestion. This wasn't a conversation that got away from them. This had been a decision. Maybe they'd convinced themselves it was a kindness, that I'd be grateful to have family close, that I'd want the pitter-patter of little feet and the scent of diaper cream drifting down the hall. Maybe they thought I'd feel honored to give up the last thing I truly called mine, but they didn't ask. Not once. Not really. They assumed, planned, acted. And I became a placeholder, the kind you erase once the real design comes in. I sat there for a long time, staring at the door, remembering the way Clarice had smiled at the guest room, like she could already see herself in it. The way Martin had nodded slow and thoughtful, as if already calculating furniture layouts and storage bins. This house had weathered 2 decades of quiet. It had held me through grief and small joys, through the long ache of holidays spent alone, and the soft pleasure of learning to enjoy that solitude. I had patched its walls, paid its rising taxes, cleared its gutters in the biting cold. It was never grand, but it was mine. Fully, wholly mine. Until now. Now I could feel it slipping, not because of legalities or force, but because of presumption. The slow erosion of respect masked as familial love. Love with expectations. Love that claimed rather than offered. I stood, walked to the bedroom, and opened the drawer where I kept the file folders. The one labeled Property, Deed and Taxes was still there. I ran a finger along its edge, not pulling it out yet, but reminding myself it existed, that I still had a say, that I wasn't powerless, just quiet, for now. In the morning, I planned to water the front shrubs, the ones Kaylee said looked tired. I'd let them stay tired a little longer. I moved the baby monitors to the top shelf of the linen closet and tucked the paint swatches behind a stack of envelopes. Then I closed the closet door and turned off the light. The hallway returned to silence, and I stood in the stillness, staring down at the worn wood floor that had carried only my footsteps for years. I wasn't just left out of the plan. I was in the way. It was late afternoon, and the house was quiet, except for the soft hum of the dryer in the back. Halden had stopped by earlier to pick up a spare key he'd left behind months ago. Something about needing it just in case. He'd dropped his bag on the kitchen chair while digging through the junk drawer and left it there when he rushed out to take a call. I hadn't meant to look. Truly, I hadn't. But as I passed the table with a dishcloth in my hand, his tablet screen lit up. No password, no lock screen. Just an open email thread sitting in plain view, and a single subject line bolded in blue timeline for interior demo. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The preview was enough. Once she's out, we can start demo before October. Upstairs, first flooring will need to go. No greeting, no sign-off. Just logistics. Like I was an obstacle being scheduled for removal. I stood there, one hand still gripping the towel, the other resting on the table's edge. My knees didn't buckle, but something inside me did. A quiet bend, like old wood under slow pressure. The message wasn't addressed to me. Of course it wasn't. It was likely for Kaylee or one of her friends, maybe even that contractor cousin she always mentioned when Halden talked about saving money. They weren't just imagining their future here anymore. They were orchestrating it. Around me, past me, over me. They had plans. Real ones. Specific ones. And all of them started with me being gone. I didn't sit down. I didn't gasp or pace or confront the silence. I just folded the towel twice, set it on the counter, and walked to the window over the sink. The light outside was thinning, catching the tops of the trees in a way that made everything feel smaller and sharper. I'd thought I had more time. I'd thought this assumption of ownership was arrogance, not strategy. But the email changed that. This wasn't hopeful daydreaming anymore. This was a sequence. First me, then the floors, then the rest. I wondered if Halden even saw it anymore, this house, this space, or if in his mind it was already a construction zone with neutral walls and a stroller in the entryway. I didn't ask him about the email when he returned. He came in like nothing had happened, grabbed his bag, kissed my cheek absently, and said, "Thanks, Mom. Oh, and Kaylee said to remind you about next weekend. We're bringing a friend to see the place." I nodded. Of course. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to recall every conversation over the past 2 months. Every hint, every omission. All the times they'd said when instead of if. All the times they'd changed things around the house and called it preparing. I rose before sunrise and made coffee in silence. I didn't open the blinds. I didn't write anything down. I just stood there, holding the mug, thinking, what would they do if I pushed back? What could they do? There were ways I knew to make people leave homes, even ones they owned. Pressure, manipulation, doubt. Lean on someone long enough, convince them they're in the way, and eventually they'll step aside just to breathe. But I wasn't stepping anywhere. Not yet. I pulled the file folder from the cabinet again, the one labeled Property, Deed, and Taxes. This time I opened it. Page after page of documents I'd kept in order for years. Receipts, escrow, paperwork, utilities in my name, the deed, clear title, fully paid off, my name. Not Halden's, not Kaylee's, not theirs. Mine. The estate binder had been tucked away on the top shelf of my bedroom closet, buried behind a stack of flannel sheets and a box of outdated electronics. I pulled it down with both hands and carried it to the kitchen table like it was something fragile, something sacred. The leather was cracked at the spine, the metal rings stiff with disuse. I remembered the day we put it together, Leon in his good sweater, me scribbling down notes while the attorney explained things neither of us wanted to dwell on. I flipped past the obvious sections first, the life insurance documents, the final expenses form, funeral preferences, simple, no flowers, cremation. We'd followed all of it down to the hymns. Then came the deed transfer, the joint accounts, the health directives, all familiar, all tidy, until I reached the very last divider. Taped into the back cover was a single page marked Contingency Language, Property Rights. I hadn't remembered this part. Maybe because Leon hadn't emphasized it. Maybe because at the time it felt theoretical. The language was clean, legal, and sharp. In the event that my spouse, Delvina Moraine, is unable to maintain the property or manage financial affairs independently, authority to act on behalf of the estate in matters of property upkeep and residential transition shall pass to the named heir. The named heir was Halden, our only child. It wasn't a transfer of ownership. Not exactly. But it opened a door. I let the paper fall back against the cardboard flap and sat still for a long moment, the chair creaking slightly under me. My hands remained flat on the table. My coffee had gone cold again. Leon wrote this. Leon, who never thought I'd need help, who told me I was the most organized woman he'd ever met, who trusted me with everything after he was gone. But even he left space for me to be replaced. Not if I died. Not if I sold the house. If I became incapable. That word hung in the air like smoke. Unable to maintain. Unable to manage. So vague. So full of holes someone like Kaylee could drive a moving van through it. I could already hear the argument. She's forgetful. She's overwhelmed. She doesn't respond well to stress. She's not handling things like she used to. I'd seen it happen. A neighbor down the street was pushed out by her own niece last year, talked into signing over power of attorney because she forgot to pay her water bill once. Once. Halden had read this clause. I remembered now. He'd helped me go through the estate papers before he moved in with Kaylee. Just to get familiar, he'd said. He'd seen the binder, held it in his hands, probably read that line and filed it away. And I had forgotten it was even there. Not because I didn't care, because I never thought my son would use it. I stood and walked to the sink, rinsed out my mug, and stared through the window at the backyard. The bird feeder Leon had built was still hanging crooked, one rope lower than the other. The squirrels had figured out how to steal from it. He used to get such a kick out of that. I hadn't fixed it since he died. Did that count as being unable to maintain the property? I dried the mug and set it back in the cabinet. Then I returned to the table, pulled a pen from the drawer, and wrote a note on a yellow, sticky review clause, seek interpretation. I placed it on the binder. If they were planning to use my husband's words against me, I'd be ready. I hadn't even had my second sip of coffee when the knock came. It was just after 7, and I was still in my robe, hair tied up slippers barely keeping the cold from my heels. I figured it was a package. Maybe the neighbor kid selling fundraiser cookies again. I wasn't expecting anyone. Certainly not her. She stood on the porch with a clipboard tucked under one arm and a camera bag slung across her chest, bright-eyed, overdressed for the weather, and smiling like she'd just found the jackpot. "Good morning," she chirped. "I'm Melinda Kaylee, said you'd let me take a few photos this morning." I blinked. Photos of what the house, she said, stepping slightly to the side so I could see the real estate logo embroidered on her bag. Just a few interior shots. Nothing major. Shouldn't take more than 30 minutes. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The door said everything for me. I closed it. Not slammed, just firm. Quiet. Controlled. A barrier returned to its rightful place. She didn't knock again. I waited in the hallway robe, still cinched tight. Heart hammering in a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. My hand hovered near the doorknob, unsure whether I wanted to open it and scream or call Halden and demand an explanation. But I did neither. Instead, I turned away, walked to the kitchen and poured the rest of the lukewarm coffee down the sink. The silence in the house felt different now. Not peaceful. Watched. Measured. They had sent someone to photograph my life. No warning. No conversation. Just a stranger invited by someone who didn't live here to take pictures for a listing that didn't yet exist, at least not officially. And Kaylee had spoken for me. I found my phone on the counter and stared at it, willing it to stay silent. It didn't. 2 minutes later, a message from Halden buzzed in. Did Melinda swing by? Just easier to get some shots while things still look lived in. Don't worry, nothing final until we all talk. We all talk. As if a conversation was still pending. As if this wasn't already moving behind my back without pause, without permission. I didn't reply. I walked to the closet again, opened the door, and pulled down the box labeled Documents Old. Inside were receipts, insurance policies, the previous renovation contract for the kitchen, even the water bill with my name printed neatly across the top. Everything they'd need to answer the question. Who owns this? I spread the papers across the dining table like a map. each sheet pointing to one truth. They didn't have a claim. They had a fantasy, a timeline, a strategy, but no legal footing. Still, that didn't mean they couldn't try. People lost homes in messier ways, emotional exhaustion, paperwork games, legal loopholes buried deep in forgotten wills. I had already seen the clause. I knew the soft spots now. I couldn't afford to pretend this was still about family dynamics. This was structural. And they had brought in a professional. They weren't treating this house like a future gift or a shared inheritance. They were treating it like a sale in process. That changed everything. I gathered the documents, refiled them carefully, and closed the box. Then I pulled the blinds in every room, checked each lock on the windows, and sat at the table again. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel caught off guard. I felt prepared. They'd made their move. Now it was my turn. Halden came over unannounced again. No warning, no knock. Just the sound of the front door creaking open like he still lived here. I was sitting at the kitchen table, half a muffin on my plate, the coffee long gone cold. "Hey, Mom," he said, setting his keys on the counter. He had that smile he used when he was trying to charm his way through something. "Can we talk?" I didn't answer. I just motioned toward the other chair. He sat, fingers tapping a slow rhythm on the table. "Kaylee told me Melinda might have caught you off guard. That wasn't the plan. We were going to talk about everything this weekend." My mug was warm in my hands, but the contents inside were stale and bitter. I took a slow sip anyway. "You know," he continued, "we're not doing this to upset you." "No," I said. "You've seemed overwhelmed. Lonely, maybe. The house is too much for one person. Kaylee just wants to help." I didn't blink. "I raised you alone, Halden. Help came late." He flinched a little. Just enough to notice. "That's not fair." "No," I said. "But it's true." He looked away, exhaled, then leaned back in his chair. "We're trying to do what's best for everyone." I smiled, small and tired. "No, you're trying to do what's easiest for yourselves, and you're calling it concern." Kaylee walked in just then, having let herself in through the back door, like she had the right. She wore that soft, neutral look that never quite reached her eyes. "Delvina," she said, setting her purse down, "we just think you'll be happier in one of those senior places, the ones with the little patios and shared gardens. You'd have people to talk to, activities, crafts and bingo," I murmured. Kaylee gave a small laugh. "Well, something like that." The kitchen felt smaller with the two of them in it. I looked down at my coffee, then up at my son. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe just more like someone I didn't know. "I like my silence," I said finally. "It's not loneliness. It's peace." "Come on," Halden said, his voice tightening. "You don't really want to spend the rest of your life rattling around this place by yourself." I stared at him. "That's not your decision to make. We're just trying to help," Kaylee said again, slower this time, like repetition made it noble. "No," I replied, setting my mug down. "You're trying to relocate the inconvenience." "The house?" "Me." Halden frowned. "You make it sound like we're pushing you out." I tilted my head. "An interior designer showed up yesterday with a camera. You didn't ask me if I was comfortable with you moving in. You told me after everything was already decided." "That's not how it happened," he muttered. "Then explain it to me," I said. "Explain how your version of helping starts with redecorating my home and planning a nursery without even speaking to me." Kaylee shifted her weight and sighed. "This isn't going the way we hoped." "No," I said. "It's going exactly the way I feared." Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Halden rubbed his temple like the conversation had exhausted him. Kaylee reached for her purse again, already preparing to leave. I stood and rinsed my mug out at the sink, back turned to them both. "I'm not leaving my home," I said quietly. Kaylee's voice was clipped. It's not forever, just until things are settled, but I was already drying the cup and putting it back on the shelf. Behind me, their footsteps moved toward the door, first Halden, then her. I didn't follow, didn't speak. The door clicked shut, and I stood there, holding nothing. The bedroom was always the one place I hadn't had to share. Even when Halden was little and toys spilled into every hallway and the living room was strewn with Legos and action figures, my bedroom remained untouched. My space. My quiet. After Leon died, I rearranged it slightly, moved the dresser closer to the window, donated the second nightstand, folded the blankets differently. Nothing major. Just enough to say this life is different now. I went to retrieve an old envelope that afternoon, a warranty from the roof repair we did 3 years ago, and opened the bottom drawer of my dresser. There, beneath a stack of postcards I never mailed, was a single folded piece of paper. I didn't recognize it. I unfolded it and immediately knew who had written it. The neat block letters weren't mine. It was a checklist. Paint nursery soft green. Remove carpet. Sap smells musty. Replace curtains neutral tones. Check plumbing in guest bath. Kitchen new backsplash. And at the bottom, under a line someone had drawn to separate priorities. Dell's room, Trachter's office space. I stared at that line longer than the rest. Not Mom's room. Not spare bedroom. Just Dell. Flattened to 2 syllables. Stripped of role, name, identity. Repurposed. They'd already decided. The transformation of this house wasn't pending my consent. It was scheduled. The nursery had a color. My carpet had been condemned. My curtains had been erased in favor of neutral tones. And my room. My room was already an office. They weren't just moving in. They were taking over. I pressed the paper flat on the edge of the dresser, running my fingers down the list as if that might smudge the words. But they stayed. I sat on the edge of my bed and felt the walls close in, not with fear, but with clarity. I hadn't been consulted. I had been rewritten. My presence was a temporary inconvenience they were planning around. Not a person. A placeholder. They didn't even pretend otherwise. I thought back to Kaylee's gentle tone in the kitchen, the way she said those senior places as if she were offering me a spa retreat. All the while, this list had existed. This plan had been drafted. My belongings categorized, my comfort considered a clutter to be cleared. I folded the paper and placed it back in the drawer this time, sliding it under the postcards. Then I stood and walked to the mirror. I didn't look frail. I didn't look incapable. I looked like a woman who had lived through enough to recognize when the floor was shifting beneath her feet. I looked like someone who needed to decide quickly and quietly whether to let the tide roll over her or start building a seawall. Outside, the sun had dipped low, casting a gold edge on everything it touched. The house glowed as if it didn't yet know it was being reimagined without its owner. I stepped into the hallway and noticed something new. A box leaned against the wall marked books. Storage. It wasn't mine. The handwriting was Kaylee's. They had brought boxes. They had already started packing. Not their things. Mine. It had been 3 weeks ago, though it felt longer now. The day was cool and overcast, the kind of sky Leon used to call quiet gray. I hadn't told anyone. Not Halden, not Kaylee, certainly not the neighbors. Just the couple, the notary, and me. We met at the coffee shop across town, the one near the library that no one I knew ever went to. They were younger, mid-30s maybe, but kind, polite. No pushy questions, no over-eager smiles. The wife had grown up just a few towns over and said she remembered walking past the house as a kid. It always looked so warm, she'd said. That had struck me. They weren't looking to flip it. No grand renovation plans, no fast resale or short-term rental schemes. They wanted a home. A quiet place to start their next chapter. The husband slid the papers across the table without ceremony. The offer was clean cash, no contingencies. They'd already spoken to their bank, already arranged for the transfer. They had done their part. Now, it was my turn. I held the pen for a moment longer than necessary. The form in front of me was simple, direct. The legal description of the house was printed at the top: street number, county lot boundaries. Below it, my name, and soon theirs. It didn't feel like giving something away. Not in the way I thought it might. It felt strangely like putting something down. A weight I hadn't noticed I was still carrying. The house had long been mine to protect, to repair, to keep filled. But now, it had become something else. A battlefield, a target, a prize. I didn't want it to be that. Not for me. Not for Leon's memory. So I signed. The notary stamped the final page, and just like that, it was done. They didn't celebrate. They shook my hand. The wife touched my arm gently and said, "We'll take care of it." I believed her. We set the closing date. I asked for a few weeks, nothing dramatic. Just enough time to sort through what I wanted to keep and what could stay behind. They agreed without hesitation. I didn't tell Halden when he called that night. He was still talking like everything was tentative, like we had time to work through it together. But he hadn't asked. Not once. Not really. So I gave him nothing. The next morning, I began the quiet work of sorting. I packed my keepsakes, my photos, Leon's cufflinks, my grandmother's sewing scissors. I donated books I hadn't opened in a decade. I folded linens that still smelled like sun and lavender. And every evening, I moved 1 or 2 boxes into the garage. Slowly, silently. I didn't want to give them the performance of leaving. I didn't want them to see me go and think they had won something. They hadn't. I had. The contract was final. The deed transfer scheduled. And the house, this beautiful, complicated house, was about to belong to someone who had never once tried to erase me from it. What Halden and Kaylee would do once they realized the sale was irreversible, I didn't know. But I knew this they would find out after it was far too late. They invited me to brunch like it was an olive branch. Kaylee picked the spot. A sleek cafe with reclaimed wood tables and hanging Edison bulbs, the kind of place where they plate everything on slate and call it rustic. I wore my softest cardigan, the one Leon liked. Not for them, for me. Halden waved when I walked in, already seated by the window. Kaylee was stirring something green into her water collagen, or chlorophyll, or whatever, was popular now. They looked like a magazine spread. Too polished, too practiced. "Glad you could make it," Kaylee said, smiling like this wasn't just another checkpoint in their plan. Halden stood, kissed my cheek, and sat again. "We thought it'd be good to talk, just the 3 of us." I ordered black coffee. No pastries, no meal. Halden launched in before the waitress had even stepped away. "So, we know the house conversation got off track last week." I sipped my coffee, letting the silence stretch long enough to make him shift in his seat. "We're not trying to steamroll you, Mom," he said. "We're just thinking long term." Kaylee nodded her hands, folded delicately on the table. "We're building something for our family." "And you're part of that," Halden added. "But you have to admit the house is too much. You shouldn't be worrying about lawn care and pipes. And that's why I've already taken care of it," I said. He blinked. "What do you mean I've made arrangements?" I said. "Things are handled." Kaylee's smile thinned, but she didn't speak. Halden leaned forward, elbows on the table now. "Mom," he said, voice lowered. "You owe us at least some stability. I have a child on the way." I set my coffee down. "Stability?" "Yes. A place we can settle into. You always said you wanted your grandchildren to know your home." "I did," I said. "But this isn't about visiting. You're trying to take it." Kaylee finally spoke. "We thought you'd be proud. We're creating something permanent. You raised Halden to be responsible. Now he's stepping up." Stepping up. That's what this was. Halden's jaw clenched. You raised me to value family, to be present. That house, your house, means something to me. I folded my napkin slowly. And what does it mean to me? Kaylee opened her mouth, but I raised a hand. I carried that mortgage alone for 18 years. I refinished those floors myself, painted the nursery the first time. I scrubbed mold out of the basement after that flood. And you think I owe you because you're about to have a baby. Halden's voice dropped tight and defensive. That house was always going to be mine. No, I said, rising. It was always going to be mine until I chose something else. I pushed the chair back gently enough to make space between us. You got a stable childhood, I said. Food on the table? A roof that didn't leak. A mother who worked nights to keep it that way. I looked at him, really looked, and saw a man who had mistaken proximity for entitlement. I don't owe you for doing my job, I said. And this house is not your inheritance just because you showed back up with a crib in your cart? Kaylee looked away. Halden sat back like I'd hit him. I hope, I said, grabbing my bag, that when your child looks at you, you remember what it takes to hold a family together. I left the napkin on the table. They didn't follow. It was easier than I expected. One phone call, one voicemail, and less than 3 hours later, I got a polite text reply. Hi, Ms. Arlen. This is Maeve Meriton. Dad said you might reach out. Would love to help. I hadn't spoken to Maeve since she was in law school. Sharp girl, always one step ahead in chess club, even as a teenager. Now she was with a firm in town and specializing in estate and property law. Perfect. We met the next afternoon in her office, a clean space with minimal decor and a coffee pot humming behind her desk. She greeted me like family and didn't waste time. I've reviewed the will, she said, clicking her pen as she flipped to a tabbed page in the copy I'd sent. And that clause about passing management to the heir. It's not enforceable on its own. I exhaled slowly. Even if he pushes it? She nodded. The clause only triggers if a licensed physician evaluates you and deems you mentally or physically incapable of managing the property. She looked at me pointedly. There's no such evaluation on record. No medical opinion, no court order, nothing. And the sale. The deed transfer is clean, Maeve said. Fully recorded. You're within your rights. They may try to argue undue influence or impaired judgment, but without evidence it won't hold. I nodded, the weight in my shoulders lightening just slightly. They're bluffing, she added, or hoping you don't know better. I looked down at the stack of papers she'd neatly clipped together for me. Legal reassurances. Protection in black ink. I'm not afraid of court, I said. I'm just tired. She smiled gently. Good thing you won't need court. I thanked her, tucked the packet into my bag, and drove home with the windows cracked, letting in the last edge of summer air. The house stood quiet when I returned. No voices, no intrusions, just the familiar groan of floorboards and the hum of the refrigerator. I placed the folder in the drawer right beside the binder. Leon left all those years ago. One truth tucked next to another. They couldn't take it from me legally. That battle was already won. But I knew Halden and Kaylee, they wouldn't go down with grace. They'd shift tactics, change tone, try shame, try guilt. Maybe even spin the story in front of family. But now I had certainty. I had clarity. And I had something far sharper than permission. I had finality. Let them throw words. I had a signature. It started with a simple intention, clearing old notifications from the doorbell app. The system hadn't been used much lately, but I still got alerts when someone stepped onto the porch. Most of them were harmless delivery drivers, the neighbor's cat, a branch caught in the wind. But when I opened the history log, one clip stood out. Dated 2 weeks prior midday, a time when I knew I hadn't been home. The motion alert had been filed and never viewed. I tapped play. The video began with Kaylee standing on the front steps, waving someone forward. The camera's fisheye lens distorted the corners slightly, but the audio was clear. "This is the front porch," she said, her voice smooth and practiced. "We're going to paint it white with matte black hardware, very coastal modern." Another woman appeared in the frame. Early 30s, high ponytail, oversized sunglasses pushed up onto her head. She was holding her phone like a mirror, clearly filming everything. "Girl, this is perfect," the friend said. "Wait, what's the deal again?" "She's moving to one of those retirement villas." Kaylee's laugh was tight. "That's the plan. Once she's out, we'll finally have room to spread out." She opened the door and motioned her friend in. The camera captured just enough of their silhouettes stepping inside before the footage ended. I checked the next clip. This one showed them walking back into view, exiting through the front door 15 minutes later. The audio picked up again as they reached the porch. "I'm thinking podcast studio here," Kaylee said, pointing to the left side of the house, the area near the sitting room. "Great acoustics once we put in carpet, and the light from the window amazing for filming." Her friend giggled. "You've got it all figured out." Kaylee smirked. "We just need her out of the way." I froze the clip. That was how she said it. No hesitation, no code or euphemism. We just need her out of the way." I watched the last seconds of the video in silence. Kaylee fixed her hair in the reflection of the glass door and winked at her own image before stepping off the porch. I sat back in my chair, phone still in hand. There it was, everything I'd suspected now said aloud. Not care, not concern, not even thinly veiled manipulation. Just entitlement dressed up in pastel tones and influencer lighting. I didn't feel angry. Not then. I felt clean. The truth had finally spoken without needing my voice. She had exposed herself. All I had to do now was let her words live where others could hear them. The conference room was small but tidy, tucked into the rear wing of the title office. It smelled faintly of toner and lemon wipes, and the only sound for several minutes was the steady shuffle of paper and the occasional clack of a pen on the tabletop. The buyers sat across from me, calm and pleasant, their voices low as they reviewed the final documents with the closing agent. They'd brought their own coffee. The woman smiled at me once reassuringly. She didn't have to. I was already certain. To my left, Halden slouched slightly, arms crossed, pretending disinterest. Kaylee sat straighter, a little too poised, like she expected cameras to turn on at any moment. Neither of them had asked to be there, but they had insisted. Kaylee claimed they deserved to know how things were handled. What she really meant was they wanted to watch me back down. But I wasn't backing down. The final pages were signed. The funds had already wired the day before Maeve had confirmed every cent. The keys, labeled and clean, sat in a simple envelope before me. I'd tied a ribbon around the spare set. Not for them, for me. A small moment of care at the end of something long. "Congratulations," the agent said to the couple standing with an extended hand. "It's officially yours." They shook her hand, then turned to me. "Thank you, Mrs. Arlen," the husband said quietly. "We're honored." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. Not from sadness, but from how close I was to finally breathing again. Halden cleared his throat loud in the soft room. "So, what happens now?" he asked, glancing between me and the couple. Kaylee blinked, confused. "I thought there was another meeting like with the estate planner." The buyers looked between themselves. The wife's smile tightened. She picked up the envelope of keys and slipped it into her purse. "There's nothing more to meet about," I said finally, turning toward them. My voice was steady. My coffee still warm in my hand. "The house is theirs." Halden's jaw twitched. "What?" Kaylee leaned forward, voice sharper. "You mean, like today?" "Yes," I said, simply. "You should start packing. This isn't mine anymore." There was a silence then. Not the confused kind, no. The kind that spreads when everyone in the room suddenly understands they've miscalculated. Kaylee's lips parted like she might argue, but no sound came out. I stood and gathered my folder. The buyers shook my hand again, their expressions kind but firm. I could see how quickly they were transitioning from hopeful applicants to protectors of their new space. That house would be well loved. As I reached the door, Halden stood, a voice quiet. "You didn't tell us?" I paused and looked at him. "No, I didn't." His face reddened. "So that's it. You just sell it and we find out at the table." "Yes," I said. "Because you never asked what I wanted. You just assumed I'd fold." Kaylee stared at the table, motionless. "I raised you better than this," I said to Halden. "I don't know where that part of you went." Then I walked out. No one followed. It took less than 40 minutes after we left the title office. I had returned home to finish packing the last of my personal items. A few books, a teacup Leon gave me on our 5th anniversary. The sweater I always kept folded on the living room armchair. The new owners were set to move in on Monday. I wanted the place to be clean. Still, Kaylee and Halden burst in like a gust of heat. No knock, no courtesy. Just the sound of the front door swinging hard enough to make the picture frame in the hallway rattle. "You sold it out from under us," Kaylee shouted before her shoes even hit the rug. She was trembling with fury, clutching her phone in one hand, like it might defend her. "You never gave us a chance," Halden added, pacing behind her. "We were building a family, and you built it on me," I said, calmly, on the assumption that I didn't matter. Kaylee slammed her purse onto the counter and spun toward the kitchen. "You didn't even tell us the timeline. We didn't have time to prepare." "You had time to plan a podcast room," I said. Her eyes flared. She grabbed the nearest object, an old glass from the drying rack, and hurled it at the wall. It shattered into 4 sharp pieces, scattering like judgment across the tile. Halden turned on her. "What the hell are you doing?" "You told me she'd roll over," Kaylee hissed. "You said she was too tired to fight, that she wouldn't sell without a conversation. She wasn't supposed to blindside us," he snapped. I stood there, watching the two of them fracture in real time. They weren't partners now. They were 2 entitled children who hadn't gotten the prize they'd circled like vultures. I stepped between them slowly. Not to intervene, but to pass. Halden's eyes met mine. There was a flicker of shame, maybe. Of understanding too late. "I taught you how to speak," I said, quietly. "I didn't think you'd use it like this." He flinched just slightly. Kaylee stared at the broken glass on the floor, her fists clenched at her sides. I didn't wait for a response. I picked up the last bag by the door, the one with Leon's letters, and walked out. The house didn't echo behind me. It didn't weep or creak or hesitate. It let me go. The motel near the bus station wasn't much to look at, just a long row of rooms with peeling numbers and a neon sign that hummed louder than it lit. But the lock clicked easily, the sheets were clean, and the coffee machine worked. That was enough. I set my bag down slowly, like I was afraid the silence might shatter. But it didn't. It held me. The room had 1 bed, 2 chairs, and a small square table near the window. I left the curtains open. There wasn't much to see, just a gas station across the street and a parking lot with more oil spots than cars. But it was mine for now. I poured a cup of coffee from the machine and sat on the edge of the bed, letting the warmth settle into my palms. My feet ached. My spine felt like someone had gently released a tight rope that had been pulling me forward for months. For the first time I couldn't remember how long I wasn't bracing for anything. No hallway footsteps, no cheerful voice announcing renovations I hadn't approved. No missing boxes, no lists with my name crossed out. Just quiet and coffee. I leaned back against the pillows and let myself exhale all the way down. There wasn't a deadline now. No one waiting on a signature or demanding my approval while pretending not to need it. The house, The furniture the years I'd handed it over with intention. And they couldn't claw it back. I didn't feel loss. I felt space. I opened Leon's letters. Just one. It was from his last year, dated in his slanted, stubborn handwriting. If you ever feel like this place is more burden than home, he'd written, don't let it trap you. The house was our shelter, not our sentence. He always knew, even when I didn't. I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into its envelope. Outside, someone started a car. A door slammed. Somewhere, a train passed. Inside, I stayed still. Let my coffee go lukewarm. Let my body remember what it felt like to sit without being needed. I didn't miss the house. I didn't miss the weight of it. I didn't miss being treated like a stepping stone to someone else's comfort. I stretched my legs out across the bed, closed my eyes, and let the hum of nothing hold me still. The phone rang just after 8. I almost didn't answer. But the number was familiar. Kaylee's mother. We hadn't spoken much, just a few pleasantries at holidays, shared casserole recipes once or twice. She always had a careful voice, sweet, but practiced like she knew how to thread every conversation around tension. Delvina, she said, after I answered. I hope I'm not calling too early. I stared at the motel ceiling. No, I'm up. There was a pause long enough to feel weighted. I wanted to talk about what happened, she said. I waited. I think maybe things just moved a little too fast. For all of you. I could already hear the direction this was going. I mean, she continued, Kaylee and Halden are devastated. They were planning so much. You blindsided them, Delvina. I sat up, slowly set my lukewarm coffee on the nightstand, and breathed out. No, I said. I stopped letting them blindside me. Silence. Then I don't think they saw it that way. Of course not, I said. They weren't looking. She shifted tone, then softening it. You know, Kaylee's always had a strong personality. She takes charge, she gets excited. Maybe she overstepped, but it came from a good place. I bit the inside of my cheek. She gave a tour of my home like it was already hers, I said. She picked out paint for my walls and planned a podcast studio without asking if I was leaving. That's not excitement. That's assumption. Another long pause. I could almost hear her fingers tapping on the counter, searching for the next soft landing. They didn't mean to make you feel erased, she offered. They didn't need to mean it, I said. They just did it. I stood and walked to the small window, watching a man hose down the sidewalk across the street. You raised a daughter who thinks love is entitlement, I said. I raised a son who let her lead the way. Her breath caught, just briefly. That's not fair. It wasn't fair when they told me I'd be happier in a senior facility, I replied. She sighed. Kaylee said you seemed lonely, that maybe this was a way to keep you from being isolated. I've been more alone in that house with them than I am in this motel room. It was quiet again. I let it be. Finally, she said, they're still your family. I nodded once to myself. And I still have boundaries. Is there anything you want me to tell them? I looked down at my phone at the motel bed, at the second mug beside the coffee machine I hadn't touched. Tell them I'm fine. And tell them. I hope they learn how to build something of their own without expecting someone else to hand it over. Her voice dropped into something colder. They just wanted to feel secure. So did I said. That's why I left. I ended the call gently. Let it settle. Then I turned off the motel lamp and watched morning begin. The apartment above the mechanic's shop wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a galley kitchen, but the rent was manageable. The lease was clean, and no one had plans to renovate it out from under me. The stairs creaked when I carried up the last of my boxes. My arms ached, my back barked, and I sat cross-legged on the floor for a full 10 minutes before I even thought about opening a drawer. It smelled faintly of oil from downstairs and cheap citrus floor polish, the kind they probably mopped through between tenants. The windows were streaked, the oven hissed when I turned it on. and one of the kitchen cabinet doors hung lower than it should have. But it was mine. Entirely, simply mine. No inherited guilt in the walls, no whispered plans behind closed doors, no lists tucked into drawers about where I'd sleep or where I wouldn't. I hung up one picture, the smallest one of Leon in the backyard with the grill and his ridiculous red apron. Just one photo. Enough to feel like a beginning, not a shrine. I brewed a fresh cup of coffee and stood near the window watching the street below. It wasn't quiet like the old neighborhood, but it was honest cars pulling in men, shouting over engines, someone dragging a trash bin down the alley. I liked it. I had just sat down at the table flipping through a utility form when the knock came. Soft, hesitant. I opened the door not sure what to expect. There on the hallway floor sat a square white box. On top a simple envelope. No name. Inside the box flowers. A low bouquet of marigold and chamomile, bright but not loud, arranged with care. I opened the envelope. Thank you for trusting us with your home. We'll take good care of it. No signature. But I didn't need one. It was the buyer's. The quiet couple with clear eyes and kind hands. The ones who didn't raise their voices when Kaylee had glared across the table, who waited for me to finish speaking, instead of stepping over my words. I carried the flowers to the windowsill and placed them gently there, sunlight slipping across the petals. A house had been taken from me, no, not taken. Offered. Sold on my terms. And in its place, this 2 rooms above a mechanic's shop. No designer nursery. No podcast studio. No place for betrayal to nest. Just this strange and beautiful thing I hadn't felt in years, space to be without explaining. I stood in the quiet coffee cooling in my hand and let kindness find me soft, late but unmistakably real. I had mailed it the night before the sale finalized. Quietly, without drama. A plain white envelope addressed simply to Halden and Kaylee slipped into the post with nothing fancy. No return address, no decoration, just edges pressed flat, sealed tight. I hadn't wanted to say anything in person. Not then. The last thing that needed to be added to that house was more shouting. It had held enough of that already. Inside the envelope were 3 things. The first, a clean copy of the deed transfer. Signed, dated, notarized. Proof in black ink that I had let go on my terms, not under pressure, not out of confusion. Not because they'd won, but because I was done. The second, a photo. Halden, at 5 years old, standing in the garden, with mud on his cheeks, holding a plastic shovel, and grinning like he'd found buried treasure. He had no front teeth then. I kept that photo in my wallet for years, tucked behind my driver's license. I chose that one because it reminded me of a time before everything became conditional, before ambition wore him down into calculation. And the third, a single sentence written in my own hand. I gave you life. Not ownership, no threats, no explanation. Just that. I'd pressed the envelope shut with care, wrote their names across the front, and slipped it into the mailbox. I imagined the moment they pulled it out. Kaylee, first probably with her fast eyes and quick hands, tearing it open, expecting maybe a recipe, an apology, or a note of instructions. Maybe she wouldn't understand the deed inside or the weight of the photo. Maybe she'd set it aside. But Halden wouldn't. He'd recognize the handwriting. He'd remember the shovel. He'd read the line, then read it again. And I hoped, quietly, without bitterness, that it would land somewhere deeper than pride. I didn't leave anything else behind. No forwarding address, because I needed to. Because he needed to know that mother does not mean possession. Because I am not his utility. Not his spare room. Not his soft landing. I walked away with less in my hands than I'd built over decades, but more in my spine than I'd felt in years. The diner on 6th Street had cracked linoleum floors and chipped mugs, but they served coffee strong enough to scrape sleep out of your bones. I sat in the corner booth by the window, the sun pushing through the blinds in thin gold slats across the table. I poured a little sugar into the cup and stirred. It clinked gently. Familiar, steady. No one in here knew my name, and that felt like a relief. The house was gone. The weight was gone. The endless obligations, the false smiles, the soft betrayals passed off as help. I didn't have to pretend anymore. There was no room left for anyone else's version of me. I took a sip and watched the traffic outside. People moved like they always had, hurried, focused, distracted. I didn't miss the silence of suburbia. The quiet there had started to rot. This noise was honest. It asked nothing of me. Somewhere Halden was probably staring at that deed copy. Maybe he'd already tried to call. I'd powered off the phone. I didn't need to hear disbelief dressed as outrage. I'd heard it all before. You're overreacting. You're being unfair. You should have told us. You owe us more time. I owed them nothing. I gave them years. I gave him childhood and tuition and soft landings. I gave Kaylee patience she never earned. They wanted the title to space the walls, but not the woman who built them. And now they had neither. I let the bitterness pass. It didn't stick as hard anymore. I wasn't the villain in their story, no matter how they might paint me. And I wasn't the victim either. I was the page-turner, the hand that closed the door without slamming it, the one who got tired of being cast in someone else's narrative and wrote a final line of her own. The waitress came by with more coffee. I slid the cup forward, nodded. She poured, without asking if I wanted a refill. I liked that. No explanation, no justification. Just coffee. The mug was warm in my hands. My name was still mine. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to defend it.